All right. Good morning, everyone. As happy as I am to have had a snow day yesterday, I am so glad this did not get canceled today. So I am happy to see so many of you out here. So my name is Chris Henning. I am the Associate Dean for Clinics, Centers, and Institutes here at Georgetown Law, but I am also the Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative. And just to say a word about our initiative seeks to raise the level of practice among juvenile defense attorneys across our region and across the country. But in addition to that, we are very much committed to policy reform. Our goal is to improve the systems that impact all of the clients that we represent. So it is my sincere pleasure to welcome all of you here today to talk about this very important issue about girls in the District of Columbia. Before I introduce Yasmin Vafa, the Executive Director of Rights for Girls, and Eduardo Ferrer, the Policy Director here at our Juvenile Justice Initiative, I want to thank our distinguished panelists who are sort of spread about here for coming and sharing their insights. I want to thank Judge Carol Dalton, Natalie Devalier, Asante Lang, and Lashana Thompson-L. So I very much look forward to hearing from them. I also want to thank Yasmin and the fantastic staff at Rights for Girls. For those of you who have not had an opportunity to work with them, Rights for Girls is a human rights organization dedicated to ending gender violence against young girls and women in the United States. They work hard to change the narrative and the policies that criminalize girls who have been victimized. And equally important, they advocate for alternative approaches and interventions, and provide girls and young women with safety and support. So I really want to say thank you to Rights for Girls for their partnership in this project. We've all learned an incredible amount from partnering on this project. I also want to thank our own Eduardo Ferrer, our policy director here at Georgetown. Yes, I stole him from DC Lawyers from Youth. I like to call him Eddie, but Eduardo was a former student of mine. And I watched him grow and evolve and do so much policy work here in the District of Columbia. And as we started to grow our initiative here at Georgetown, I convinced him to come back and be with us long term. And Eduardo has worked on a number of projects, a number of reports and issue briefs and budget briefs and data collection over the years at DCLY. So we're, again, happy to bring Rights for Girls together with the Juvenile Justice Initiative, and just happy to be here. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Eduardo and Yasmin for the program. Thank you.
So thank you all so much for being here with us on such a snowy and cold day. We're truly grateful, and it's been very exciting for us to be able to launch this report. Before we begin, Eddie and I have to thank a number of folks who really made today and this report possible. I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge Ruby Coles of the Mariah Fund. Thank you so much for just believing in this work, for believing in the importance of raising up the experiences and the lives of young girls here in our community, and making sure that they were not forgotten. And without your support and your belief in helping us put this report together, it wouldn't have been possible. We also have to thank the Novo Foundation. Their commitment to marginalized young women and girls of color was integral to letting us be able to pull together the staff and the resources to really make this report happen. And so we are grateful to both of you, as well as the Public Welfare Foundation and the Anonymous Fund of the Greater Washington Community Foundation. Thank you so much for your belief and support in our work. And then, of course, I have to thank Eddie and my co-authors on the report, Maheen Kaleem, who unfortunately couldn't be here. She snuck in New York in the snow, Sharice Hopkins and Emily Feldhake for their incredible work and time and commitment that they put into making this report a reality. And last but not least, we have to thank our EJW fellow, Rebecca Burney, whose tenacity really, really helped us get the report finalized and get us to a point where we're all here to celebrate its launch. And so we are truly grateful for all of the folks that made today possible.
Also, this report wouldn't be possible without the partnership of a lot of DC government agencies who are willing to share their data with us. So I really want to thank the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, Metropolitan Police Department, the Office of the Attorney General, and the courts for their willingness to partner with us. We actually haven't announced this, but this is actually part one of what will be a two-part series. Part two will contain additional data and some of the data that we weren't able to get in time for today. So we're really looking forward to doing a follow-up to this that will include some qualitative information as well as more data to expand on the trends that have been happening with girls in the DC juvenile justice system. So thank you very much to all of our partners.
So, you know, I think in the last several years, we've been really fortunate to see increased conversations at the national level and at many state and local levels among lawmakers, among our community, really emphasizing the importance of looking at the harms of mass incarceration, things like the school-to-prison pipeline, and the need for really thoughtful and meaningful criminal and juvenile justice reform. But as advocates who really focus on young women and girls, we have seen the ways in which our girls have been largely invisibilized from these conversations. And this is true despite the fact that we now know through national trends that girls are the fastest growing segment of the juvenile justice population. But this is not because our girls are becoming increasingly violent or committing serious acts. It's actually from our observations and that of a number of providers and our partners and girls themselves that we've been able to interact with, a result of over-policing of girls' behavior, deeming such behavior as problematic or delinquent, when in fact, in our view, it's largely a result of underlying trauma and abuse. And so over the years, we've really been able to look at some of the national trends. And so I'm going to start talking about what some of the drivers are that we're seeing nationally through our work at Rights for Girls, and then looking at how these drivers are reflected in our community among girls here in DC. And so here are just some of the drivers that we've experienced. So the first being the abuse to prison pipeline. And this is a term that we coined at Rights for Girls a number of years ago to describe the pathways of gender violence that are fueling girls and predominantly girls of color into the juvenile justice system as a direct result of suffering violence and often exploitation. We actually launched a report a couple of years ago, really mapping this pipeline with our partners here at the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality, as well as the Ms. Foundation that really tracked a number of these specific trajectories. And so here you'll see the main manifestations of the pipeline that report focused on, and what we've really observed across the country is the criminalization of girls for status offenses, things like running away when they're often trying to escape situations of abuse or violence in their homes or in their foster care placements, the criminalization of child sex trafficking victims, even though many of them are young to even consent to any sexual activity, and even though we have federal and state laws that recognize them as victims of human trafficking, we're still seeing the criminalization of these girls for prostitution and other related offenses. And then the final manifestation of the pipeline that we've really seen is the crossover of girls from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system, again, largely stemming from abuse. So one of the other drivers that we've seen is the overcriminalization of status offenses. Of course, we know that girls are overrepresented among status offenders. Running away is one of the most common offenses for girls, which really begs the question of what are they running to or what are they running from? And unfortunately, our systems are too quick to instead problematize that behavior instead of trying to really look at the root causes of what's even driving that behavior. And so that's another real important gateway into the justice system for girls. Crossover, dual-jacketed youth, we know that girls are coming from the child welfare system into the juvenile justice system. Again, often this results from fights or conflicts within child welfare placements, predominantly in congregate care, group home facilities. And what we're also seeing and what we're hearing from young girls themselves is this over-reliance on bringing police into what would typically be, normal teenage arguments or fights in the child welfare setting, and as a result, girls are then being crossed over into juvenile justice system. One of the other mechanisms of crossover, again, is rooted in domestic child sex trafficking, because what we know from a number of states is that many, if not the majority, of domestic child sex trafficking victims actually come directly from our foster care system. And so that's another way in which they are routed into the juvenile justice system for prostitution and other related offenses. One of the other emerging trends that we're seeing is the unfortunate and unintended consequences of mandatory domestic violence arrests. And so this is something that I think a number of jurisdictions across the country are starting to pay more attention to, DC being one of them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we're seeing is in many cities throughout the country, when young girls are having family disputes, most often what we're seeing is fights with mom, fights with grandma. When law enforcement comes in, they're often forced to make an arrest. And they're more likely then to arrest the young girl instead of the adult or the provider or perhaps the person who's instigating the fight. And so as a result, we're getting these girls funneled into the system as a result of these laws. And this is something that we really, really need to address. Another driver is school pushout. Of course, we're always trying to emphasize the importance of schools as a protective buffer for our young girls, because once they are pushed out for what we know to be predominantly subjective reasons, oftentimes rooted in things like trauma or sexual harassment on schools, they have a really hard time of not only being able to transfer credits, but really getting back on track for achievement. And so pushing girls out of school ends up having a really, really devastating ripple effect. And this is one, again, that we'll talk about in terms of how it's shaping the lives of our girls here in DC. And then poverty and housing instability. This is another important driver. Of course, we know that homelessness often lands girls in a position of being arrested, again, for status offenses, running away, curfew violations. But we also know that being out on the street lands girls in more precarious situations. It adds to their vulnerability. And again, it can lead to instances of domestic child sex trafficking, often in the form of what we talk about as survival sex, where girls are forced to engage in sex acts with adults and predominantly adult men in order to meet their basic needs around shelter and around food. And so these are some of the key drivers that I think we have observed at the national level, and then we're going to talk about the ways in which these issues are manifesting in our community among girls in DC. And so I'm going to hand it over to Eddie to really drill down on what we're seeing locally.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. I actually want to start with this next slide here. So for many years, we have been focused at DC Lawyers for Youth on the overall trends of what was happening in DC with regard to arrest. And for the most part, as you can see, when we were looking at trends with regard to arrest and petition, it was good news. We were seeing both going down and going down pretty significantly over time. Part of the impetus for this report was then there was a little bit of a discrepancy between what we were seeing overall and then what we were seeing anecdotally on our caseloads. So while we were seeing fewer guys on our caseloads coming into the system, we were starting to see an increase in girls. So about 2 years ago, we reached out to Rights for Girls, as everyone kept telling us, these are the people that you really need to talk to, and started asking questions about what's going on at the national level. What's happening across the country? Is this potentially something that we're just kind of seeing on our caseloads because it's just random, or is there something to it? And Rights for Girls really did a good job of educating us on the national trends that Yasmin talked about. Then we started collecting data from DC. So while it was great news when you look at the macro trends with regard to arrests and petitions in the district, they've fallen dramatically since 2009, which is fantastic. But we aren't seeing those trends hold true for young girls in the district. In fact, what we've seen over the last 10 years is the exact opposite. So in DC, we tease out 4 key trends in our report. And I'd like to do 2 qualifications before we get into the key trends. The first is when we asked for the data, and also the data that's collected and reported is reported in a gender binary manner, right? So it's reported guys and girls or boys and girls. And we don't get to see the level of detail with regard to the real gender identity of our clients and of the young people who are coming into contact with the juvenile justice system as a result of the way that the data is broken up. And it's hard to collect that information. But that's one of the shortcomings and one of the limitations of our report, is that we can't go into gender identity. And that matters because we know that young people who identify as LGBTQ are often disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. So we want to make sure that folks understand that at the get-go. The other limitation is, for this report, we really focused on the delinquency system. We just, because of our production schedule and kind of our planning, didn't have time to get all of the data on the PIN side from the court. So that will be part 2 of the brief, as we'll go more into that data and further explain what's happening on the status offense side. But we know, again, that girls tend to be disproportionately represented on the status offense side. And so those are 2 limitations I just want to put up front. So on the delinquency side, what we're seeing in terms of big picture trends are that in DC, girls make up a larger proportion of system-involved youth at all points in the system over the last 10 years. So across arrests, across petitions, across commitments to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, girls are making up a larger proportion. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on all of these. The second key trend that we're seeing is that girls become justice system involved at a younger age than boys. This was really, for me, one of the surprising findings, is that girls tend to get involved at 15 and under at rates much higher than boys get involved at 15 and under. The third finding is that girls aren't dangerous. The girls who are coming into contact with the system, by and large, are not coming into contact for very serious offenses. 86% come into contact with the system for non-violent, non-weapons offenses. And so there's a lot that we'll try and unpack over the course of the presentation, the panel, and Q&A about some of our hypotheses behind why it is then that girls are coming into contact with the juvenile justice system. And then the last one is that there are significant racial disparities among DC system-involved youth. Black girls are the most impacted when it comes to being arrested and pulled into the juvenile justice system in the district. So, what do we see in terms of overall trends with regard to gender? So as you can see, 2007, there were just over 3,000 arrests of boys. In 2016, that number dropped to just about 2,350, a little under 2,350. Good news overall for boys. Pretty substantial decline there, about 22%. Girls, on the other hand, during that time period rose from 490 in 2017 to 918 in 2016, an 87% increase. So everyone who has a copy of the report, you will see in the report it says 83%. That was an unfortunate typo. We will be sending out an updated report via email online, so please cite the online copy. Make a little note to yourself in the book. But it is actually an 87% increase in arrests for young women over that period of time. Putting it in a little bit of a different context. So in 2007, fewer than 1 in 7 youth who were arrested in the district were girls. If you look at 2016, it's over 1 in 4. It's about 28%. So girls have, the mix of girls in the system is changing and is becoming a larger and larger portion. This matters in a big way because oftentimes when we look at the way the juvenile justice system has evolved over time, within its history, it has been very focused on the needs of boys, and we have very much not paid as much attention to the needs of girls as we should have been. And that also goes, I think, for when we talk about at-risk youth and investing in front-end prevention, we're often talking about investing in programs that are geared to boys as well. And so we need to be paying more attention to the girls in our city and how we keep them from coming into the system and how we better serve them when they do. Now, that's the bad news, right, is that arrests have gone up. The good news is that while girls are a higher percentage of petitions and commitments than they were 10 years ago, petitions and commitments have gone down for girls during the same time period. They just didn't go down as fast as they went down for boys. So for petitions in 2007, 1 in 7 of all petitions were of girls. In 2016, 1 in 5 were of girls. For commitments in 2007, 1 in 10 girls who were committed, or 1 in 10 youth who were committed were girls. And in 2016, it was 1 in 5. So you're seeing pretty dramatic differences in the mix that girls make up at every point of the system. The second key conclusion is that girls are becoming justice system involved at younger ages than boys. This one surprised me, and we have a couple of different hypotheses as to why that is. But the data shows basically that starting in 2013, over half of all arrests of girls were for girls 15 and under. And that's compared to just about 45% of boys. Sorry, that's for 2015. If you look at 2015, it's nearly 60% of arrests are of girls compared to about 45% of boys. So you're seeing that when you look at which girls even are arrested, you're seeing that girls are arrested at much younger ages than boys are. And you actually see this reflected in the commitment data as well. So if you look at all of the youth who are committed to the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, girls tend to be committed, really the median age is about 16, whereas for boys it's closer to 17 or 18. So you see a mix even within the committed population of girls trending younger than the boys who are committed. The other thing that we saw is we tried to look at, okay, so let's break it down a little bit more granularly, and let's look at, on a per capita basis, what's happening within these age groups. And what we saw when we broke it down is that for all of the different age groups for boys, so for 16 and 17-year-old boys and for 13 to 15-year-old boys, on a per capita basis, you saw a decline in arrests. For girls, you saw huge increases across both of those age groups. 67% increase in per capita arrests for 16 and 17-year-old girls in the district, and 158% increase over time for 13 to 15-year-old girls. So when you think about how girls' arrests have increased over time, where you're seeing the biggest growth in those arrests is among 13 to 15-year-old girls, so trending really at the younger age of the spectrum. So why are girls coming into contact with the system? Why are they getting arrested, according to the data? Our key conclusion with regard to this question from the data is that girls in the district aren't dangerous. So I mentioned that 86% of the girls who are arrested for nonviolent, non-weapons offenses. And this is taking the definition of violence from the FBI and MPD, which is essentially violent crimes are defined as robbery, aggravated assault, rape and sexual abuse, and murder. Those are what's considered violent offenses. And then we also included all of the weapons offenses in that. So 86% are arrested for nonviolent, non-weapons offenses. And what we see is actually the single largest driver for arrests of girls is simple assaults. So what we see underlying the data is that at the core of what's driving girls' involvement into the system is really interpersonal disputes, right? So fighting, having disagreements, and responding in a way that we would all probably say is not necessarily pro-social, but in a way that's also very developmentally normative and common, and also not necessarily something that should be criminalized for young people. So simple assault for young women was by far the highest driver, the single highest driver of arrests for young women. Interestingly, when you compare it to boys, so what we also did was to try and get a sense of all of the potential arrests that could happen for interpersonal disputes. We grouped all of the assaultive arrest categories into one. And what you see is that for girls, for almost all of the years, right around 60% of all of the arrests were for some category of assaultive behavior. So from simple assault all the way up to aggravated assault, assault with a dangerous weapon, assault on a police officer, robbery, etc. Right? So assaultive behavior drives arrests for girls compared to boys, which are below about 30% for almost every year. So there's also a stark disparity between the reasons why girls are becoming involved in the juvenile justice system when you compare them to boys. And again, this comes back to the notion of when we look at the macro level trends, right? When we focus on the city has seen incredible declines, which is fantastic, in robberies, in homicides, in aggravated assaults, on the macro level, right? But when we don't break down the data and really look at the subpopulations and look at the different unique populations that are involved in the system, we potentially miss some trends and we miss some issues, which means we also miss opportunities. And we miss the opportunity to engage with young women early on to prevent some of this work from happening, and also to push our system to better respond to the behavior of young women instead of criminalizing it, but equipping them to handle situations more productively. We see very similar trends as well in terms of the differences when it comes to commitment. So for young women, 70% of all of the girls committed to DYRS are there on misdemeanor or status offense charges. Compare that to about 43% for boys, right? So girls are ending up deeper in the system for what at least the data shows seems to be less serious offenses. So there's a lot that over time we need to unpack there to find out what is it that's leading to this sliding of girls kind of deeper and deeper into the system compared to boys. And then the last big trend that I'll discuss is looking at intersectionality. So when you look at the intersectionality of race and gender, you see that there are huge, huge disparities in terms of who gets arrested in this city. So black girls in the District of Columbia, as of 2015, 51 per every 1,000 were arrested. It's about 5 in 100, 5% were arrested in the District of Columbia that year. That's up from 20 in 2007. So over the last 10 years, we've seen over a double in terms of the total number of girls arrested every year. I want to talk a little bit about methodology. Oftentimes when people look at per capita arrests, what they do is they take the total arrests for the jurisdiction, they look at the total population, and then they figure out per capita. We wanted to get deeper into it. So we actually had MPD disaggregate and tell us unique arrests for girls in this age population that were actually listed as being residents of the District of Columbia. So we excluded all arrests for DC and Maryland. So another way to think about this is in 2015, for 10 to 17-year-old black women in the District of Columbia, 5 in 100 were arrested in that year. Very stark disparity compared to white boys and white girls, where it was 1 in 100, right? Or actually, sorry, not even 1 in 100, 0.1 in 100, right? So 30 times more likely, or they're arrested at 30 times the rate of white boys and white girls in the District of Columbia. The other interesting thing that I want to talk about here, which is not something we necessarily have the answer to, but I think is something we need to be paying attention to, is part of the reason the disparities went up so significantly and the rate of arrest went up so significantly is at the same time that arrests of black girls were going up, there were fewer and fewer black girls living in the District of Columbia. So whereas in 2007, I think there were about 18,000 black girls between the age of 10 and 17 living in the district, by 2015, it was closer to 14,000. So we had seen a pretty significant decline in the population of black girls in the district at the same time that the number of girls getting arrested was going up. So we need to ask ourselves, what's driving that population decline? There could be some good trends behind that population decline, right? Folks waiting later to have kids, folks moving out of the city because of economic opportunities, et cetera. There's also the downside, or the possible downside, which is that part of what's happening is gentrification is pushing black families out of the district at the same time that we're arresting more and more girls. So we really, it's an interesting data point that we need to spend more time as a community looking into, getting a handle on, and really trying to figure out what's at the root of both the decrease in population of black girls in the district and the increase in their rate of arrests. I do want to say two other quick points just in terms of positive trends that we're seeing in the district, because they have been mentioned and referred to so far. So a lot of other jurisdictions have mandatory arrests for domestic violence for young kids and adults. In the Comprehensive Youth Justice Amendment Act, DC now gives discretion to police officers to not arrest when the alleged perpetrator is a young person. So a number of district stakeholders went and actually did a program at the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform here at Georgetown a number of years ago to learn about diversion trends and realize that for a lot of what's called adolescent domestic battery in youth, system involvement can be very counterproductive. So they brought those lessons home from that session and took a look at how do we create better diversion programs for our young people in the district. And the ACE diversion program is a great example of a high-quality diversion program in the District of Columbia. And also, how do we give our officers more flexibility to respond to situations such that we're not needlessly bringing kids into the system. So that's a positive trend, and my hope is that will have a downward impact on the arrests of young women going forward. The other positive trend is with regard to status offenses. And this is that prior to October 1st of 2017, in the District of Columbia, a young person could be securely detained for a status offense violation. So it could be truancy, it could be running away from home, and they could end up in prison for it or in jail for it. As of October of last year, they can now be removed to a shelter care facility, which is a facility in the community, and they can go to their regular schools, but they can no longer be placed at the Youth Services Center, our facility here. So DC is ahead of the curve, I think, in terms of both of those compared to other jurisdictions across the country. And the hope is, based on the research, that that'll show some real positive trends and positive impacts for young people in the city. We're going to have a panel discussion now and then open it up for folks to answer or to ask questions of the panelists and also of Yasmin and myself in terms of the findings of the report. But we'll tease out a lot of these different issues through this discussion that we have. We encourage it to be very interactive, so start thinking about your questions now, write them down. We'll have mics in the middle and encourage people to come up and ask questions. And what I'd like to do now is to introduce the panelists. Oh, the other thing is, with these panelists, there are also a number of other great initiatives that are going on in the District of Columbia. DYRS has some very exciting initiatives that they're doing with regards to girls. The court has recently launched the Hope Court, which is a specialty court, a problem-solving court that's focused on meeting the needs of young people who have been commercially and sexually trafficked, which we know tends to have a disproportionate impact on girls. So there are a lot of positive trends, a lot of innovative stuff that's happening in the district. We'll have an opportunity to tease some of that out and talk about it. It is now my pleasure to introduce.
Should we invite them up first?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if the panelists can come on up. And so as the panelists are getting situated, I'll do biographies of everyone and introductions. We are very, very pleased and would really like to thank again all of the panelists for participating with us today. Their various experiences they all have a wealth of varying experience within the system itself and the different roles they've played throughout the course of their lives and their careers, and their insights and experiences are going to be invaluable for the discussion today. So I'd like to start with Judge Carol Dalton as the presiding judge of the Family Court. From January 2014 through December 2016, she was the deputy presiding judge. Since her appointment as associate judge in 2008, she has served on the mental health, private adoptions, juvenile behavioral diversion, domestic relations, and child abuse and neglect calendars. From 2002 until 2008, Judge Dalton was a magistrate judge, presiding mainly over child abuse and neglect matters. And prior to that, she was the director of the DC Superior Court's Council for Child Abuse and Neglect Office. Over the years, Judge Dalton has participated as a member of a number of committees tasked with improving court procedures and practices in the area of family law. These committees include the Family Court Training, Family Court Implementation, Family Court Advisory Rules and Practice Standards, Superior Court Domestic Relations, Neglect and Abuse Committee, Initial Arraignments Working Group, Mental Health Stakeholders Group, Mental Health and Habitation Subcommittee. Prior to becoming a judge, she maintained private legal practice that included child abuse and neglect, probate, and corporate law. Judge Dalton received her BA from the City College of the City of New York, a JD from New York Law School, and an LLM from GW. Judge Dalton has been a resident of DC for over 30 years, and she's a former ANC commissioner, which I did not know. It's very cool. She's also served as the chair of several committees of the DC Women's Bar Association and volunteered at a number of nonprofits across the city. So please welcome Judge Dalton. Asante Lang is currently the program manager for DYRS's Achievement Center. The Achievement Center was created in 2014, and since its inception, it has evolved from providing a safe space for committed youth to offering vocational training opportunities and serving all transitional age youth within the District of Columbia. Ms. Lang holds a Bachelor of Arts degrees in Public Justice from the State University of New York at Oswego. She earned a master's degree in Public Administration with an advanced degree certificate in Nonprofit Management from Long Island University. She comes to us with over 20 years' experience in serving at-risk youth populations in both New York City and the District of Columbia. She has implemented industry-recognized workforce development certification programs while at DYRS. These programs include plumbing, electrical wiring, barbering, cosmetology, hospitality management, driver's ed, and Safe Serve certifications. Asante believes that if youth and families are provided opportunities, they can turn challenges into choices and choices into change. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Lang. LaShania Thompsonell is the author of Through the Wire, My Search for Redemption. Through the Wire is a book about LaShania's life growing up in Washington, D.C. prior to her incarceration. It's a timely memoir about youth violence and trauma from the perspective of a girl born and raised in Washington, D.C. At the age of 19, Ms. Thompsonell became incarcerated and she remained in prison for 18 years. She was released in 2011. Since her release, Ms. Thompsonell has worked for the D.C. Corrections Information Council, inspecting prisons where D.C. residents are incarcerated. She was responsible for monitoring conditions of confinement. She has also worked with the Mayor's Office on Returning Citizens Affairs, coordinating female reentry services. Ms. Thompsonell currently works at the D.C. Office of the Attorney General, where she serves as a restorative justice facilitator. She holds her Bachelor of Arts degree in Human Relations. She's also the subject of a short documentary entitled Time Zone. The film chronicles the first 2 years of her reentry process. In June of 2013, Ms. Thompsonell launched a nonprofit organization known as The Wire, Women Involved in Reentry Efforts. The Wire is a network of previously incarcerated women who have joined together to provide social support to women currently incarcerated and women returning from incarceration. Through The Wire, Ms. Thompsonell is committed to working to help reduce mass incarceration in half by 2030. Please welcome Ms. Thompsonell. And last but certainly not least, we have Natalie Ann Del Valle. Ms. Del Valle is a full-time student at Trinity University, works part-time at DYRS, and is a mother of a precocious and precious 4-year-old daughter. Through her position at DYRS, Natalie engages court-involved youth and provides them with both DYRS and community resources. She provides youth with insight on programming and serves as a bridge between the young people and their caseworkers. Her connections with issues regarding family support, youth aftercare services, and programs to help young parents is a personal one. As a product of the child welfare system and juvenile justice system, Ms. Del Valle has witnessed ineffective policies regarding system-involved girls firsthand. She believes that the system needs a reformation that starts with the people most impacted. Ms. Del Valle lives in Washington, D.C. with no immediate family support, but with the support of her community, she was able to defeat the odds. Throughout her teenage years in the system, Ms. Del Valle took advantage of every opportunity to advocate for girls and provide insight on the experiences of system-involved youth. Through advocacy, she has seen improvements in systems policies and is passionate about continuing her advocacy efforts. She believes that every young person deserves an equal opportunity towards a childhood and success. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Del Valle. And Ms. Vafa is going to take it away and moderate the panel.
Thank you so much, Eddie. And again, as Executive Director of Rights for Girls, it's been such a privilege for us to partner with Eddie and the Georgetown Center on Juvenile Justice Initiative on this project. And we're so grateful to have our panel of experts here with us today. All of you come in direct contact with young girls in our community. Many of you have experienced the system yourselves. And so I want to just ask a couple of questions of our panelists. And again, I want to encourage our panelists, to the extent you have any comments or additions, please feel free to chime in, and then we're going to open it up to our audience for any additional questions on either the report or from our panelists. And so with that, I want to start with you, Natalie. We've discussed how one of the major pathways for girls into the justice system is as a result of crossover or coming over from the child welfare into the juvenile justice system. I'm curious, based on your own experiences and your observations, why do you think it is that girls are crossing over into the system?
Thank you. I think a big reason why a majority of the young ladies are crossing over to the juvenile justice system is first the crimes that they're committing, similar to what Mr. Eduardo,
Yeah.
Mr. Farrell was explaining earlier. The crimes that a lot of the young ladies commit are often different from the male population. They're more aggressive with the male population versus the young ladies. So I can speak off my personal experience, if you don't mind. I can share a quick little story, how my experience in the child welfare system transferred into the juvenile justice system off of something that could have been resolved if I had a guardian, or for someone who's in the child welfare system, I would suggest an immediate response type of team. As I know, that's another topic, but like on weekends, when the normal business hours are finished, it's hard to get that immediate support for someone who's in child welfare system. We'll have to wait till the next business day or for the supervisor to be in the office to help assist us. So for example, when I was a young person, I was probably around 14 years old, and I was in a group home, and my basic needs, similar to Mr. Farrell was stating, weren't being met, such as deodorant, basic hygiene products. So I was the youngest in the group home, learning from the other young ladies in there. So we went down the street to Columbia Heights, and we started to steal our basic needs. At that given moment, that was my first involvement with, I guess, breaking a law, and I was really trying to receive my basic need. At that moment, I got caught, and they received all the stolen items. But if I would have had a parent to come and pick me up, they would have alleviated that the criminal case, and I would have went home that day. But because I was a product of the child welfare system, immediately I was in handcuffs and escorted to YSC, and that was the first experience. But after that time, many times I found myself in a detention center just because I didn't have a guardian to come in to get me, to teach me as well not to do that and to help me with gaining my basic needs. So I would definitely say the main difference between the males and the female population, from what I experienced, are the charges that we're committing, and also not having immediate authority to come and to get us, to save us before the system takes over, hypothetically, is what I would like to say.
No, I think that's a really powerful indication of one of the aims of our report, which is really to encourage systems professionals to really look at the underlying causes, right, the root causes of these behaviors, right? Obviously, a young person who is taking it upon themselves to steal things like deodorant, right, is really indicative of not any type of criminal intent, but a desire to meet their basic needs. And I think that that's a really powerful illustration. My next question is for Asante. I'm curious, based on your experience, what are some of the most urgent needs of girls that you're seeing in the system, as well as what are some of the strengths that you witness every day among our girls?
Sure. So I think similar to what Natalie said, is Maslow's basic hierarchy of needs, right? So it's really simple things that young women don't have that lead them to come into further into the system. So hygienic kits is something that we store at the achievement centers in order to not only service our young people, but also community young people. We also find that young people have stabilization issues at home. Really things, normative things that is adolescence that other young people are experiencing in the home, because our young people suffer from mental health challenges and/or families suffering from stabilization issues, as it relates to alcohol, substance abuse. Our young people don't have the same type of supports, so they wind up coming to us for supports. I think as it relates to what type of strengths do they have, young women are their own advocates, right? So they are vocal. They are expressive. They have strong leadership capabilities. I think that young people are able to, young women rather, they're able to tell you what are their challenges. Part of what we try to do at the Achievement Center is to help them vocalize those challenges, but those are strengths that they do currently have.
And can you talk a little bit more about what some of the programs you have in place at DYRS that are geared towards girls?
Sure. So presently, we have the Journey Beyond program, and that's an extension of our program that's currently housed at New Beginnings, our local RTC, if you will, Residential Treatment Center. That program is designed to provide further supports for young people that transition out of New Beginnings. However, it's been really successful in creating a strong camaraderie and allowing us to address their needs, that we've now extended the program to service all committed young women, but also open it up to community. Currently at the Achievement Center, all of our programs are extended to families of our agency as well as community members. So we have found that we would like to focus on preventative care. So as a result of that, we have grief and loss counseling. One of the challenges that we see is there is a lot of violence going on in our young women's communities, and they're in need of those services. Sex trafficking, that's a really big one. We're actually in the process of getting our young people trained on a peer-to-peer mentorship program. That's really important for us because they're learning from each other. One of the things that we found through our Journey and Beyond program is they are advocating for each other. They're able to help calm each other down now when they have challenges in group. They check on each other. So I think having a strong community supports is really important for young women, because now our young women are able, they let us know beforehand what the challenges are, and when they can't address it, then they come to us for supports. We also have a life skills group called Women Who Boss. It's really important that you find programming that's engaging, that can speak to what young women are interested in. And that program is a rites of passage program that really focuses on their needs, their life skills, helps them to make better decisions around finances as well, and entrepreneurship. They also help young women to create their own clothing lines. We have an EAT program that does that as well. And DWARS is now in the process of creating our Youth and Families Division, creating a girls unit, which we're really excited about. That's going to be coming out effective April the 1st. And what that's going to be is a partnership amongst care coordination and the youth engagement specialist team, in addition to the credible messengers. And that's going to be specialized programming where we have, it'll be different from the boys in that there'll be weekly programming. We're going to have a different way and different expectations for young women's needs to be met. We're also going to have a strong partnership with the credible messenger group and the youth engagement specialists.
Thank you. Judge Dalton, Asante mentioned violence and its pervasiveness in our community. Right now, of course, the Me Too movement is really flourishing and helping to raise awareness about just the pervasiveness of sexual harassment and sexual violence across the country. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective and experience, how does this movement overlap with the experiences of our girls here in the juvenile justice system?
So, long answer, short answer required, big topic. I think the women's movement made it possible in Hollywood and through in the media for women to reach certain positions of power that women could finally speak up, but it was 2018. I'm looking around and thinking maybe I'm the oldest one in the audience, but my grandmother couldn't vote until 1920. My mother, if she lived in a certain state, 50 states, it was 1958 before all women could serve on juries, rather, and that meant you could serve, but did you actually get picked? And so we finally, it took till 2018 for very strong, powerful women to speak out, for Selma Hayek and women like her to say, I didn't tell my husband that I was raped. I kept it inside. I suffered through it. Anyone in the room who's experienced rape or groping, it changes your life. It affects your mental health. It causes drinking. It may cause excessive sex. It causes not functioning at your job. So come to our girls. I don't even know if they have a voice to know that it's rape. My mother's boyfriend had sex with me. My cousin assaulted me. My neighbor did this to me. I can't go home. I don't want it to happen again. I'm running the streets. I'm depressed. I'm not going to school. I'm drinking. I'm smoking marijuana. And then in some states, and we did in the district until years ago, they're charged with prostitution. How can a child prostitute? They can't prostitute with an adult male. So I think the Me Too movement realizes, and some women are putting money into it, that they're speaking for themselves, who are powerful women. You haven't heard from Wall Street yet. They're powerful women. So our girls, hopefully there's funding for them to be able to speak for themselves, and hopefully today, what we're looking at is how we ignored them in the system and how we can deal with them differently, how we can understand when they act out in court, how we can say, when you're rolling your eyes at me, you're rolling your eyes at me because you don't trust me and you got issues and you don't trust anyone. And I'm not locking you up because you ran the streets, which hopefully we're not doing. But I think it's the beginning of a Me Too movement for girls who have very little power, and we have to give them power. Maybe we need more women in the prison system. Maybe we need, we don't want them in prison, but we need more women in power to help these young women who don't have a voice like the women in Me Too finally got.
Yeah, and I think that's a powerful point. We're obviously hearing the narratives from some of the most, powerful, influential women in our country, and that's really what it took for people to pay attention, or at least come to terms with the pervasiveness of this issue. But in many ways, through our findings, the research that we've done at the national level, and certainly what we've started to see here at the local level with the levels of ACEs, and particularly among Black girls that are suffering multiple levels of trauma, and the highest level of ACEs, this is what Me Too looks like for some of our most marginalized young women and girls, and that too often our systems respond in a way that's punitive. Not only are they getting the services and interventions or the opportunities to heal as, some other members of our community that perhaps are afforded more economic stability, more family stability, and the opportunity to readily access services, but in the most egregious cases, we're actually punishing and criminalizing them for their experiences of violence. And you alluded to, and a couple of our panelists have alluded to, sex trafficking, which is under the federal definition and under most state laws is the involvement of any child under the age of 18 in a commercial sex act, where there doesn't need to be any showing of force, fraud, or coercion. It's just their mere involvement. And Eduardo also talked a little bit about the development of the Hope Court here in the district. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impetus for the Hope Court and what it really says about the unique needs of girls in our community and how the court is trying to adjust to better suit their needs.
So it took 3 years or 4 years before we started Hope Court. I think Judge Puy-Lugo started working with Rights for Girls in Courtney's House and other stakeholders. I think he said the first year, obviously not the organizations that are here, but the first year it took a year to get people to understand that there really is sex trafficking in the United States. My own husband would say, when I was on neglect and abuse, we knew that some of our girls were trafficked. We knew that they were here for the Redskins games. Nobody wants to believe it's happening in the United States. It's happening big time. So it took a couple of years to get everyone on board to say it does exist, which in and of itself now, people doubt it. I still hear negative comments like it's prostitution court. It's not. It's not only girls that are trafficked, but girls are trafficked in much larger numbers and they respond differently. And so far, we have only girls in the Hope Court. I mean, I have traveled where I've met like a couple of male judges who were trafficked, but we have more girls are trafficked. And so now we're trying to provide services for them. Obviously, resources are needed for placements. We do have therapy oriented, hopefully, towards the young ladies that we're dealing with. We do have some resources that are providing the needs of towels and bath products and coming back to court on a regular basis. Obviously, they're going to run. We're not going to, certainly, we can't detain, nor do we want to detain them, but we want them to come back into court to the point where they feel safe enough that we get them whole and get them away from their traffickers. I think we have a juvenile court, which we currently have maybe 10 girls. We do know that in the neglect court, there are some children that are trafficked that are on calendars, which we are creating protocols. There was some disagreement with putting the neglect children, separating them from the other children in the family, but we will be putting neglect children on Judge Rook's Hope calendar and dealing with them, where we will have resources from Child and Family Services. So, I mean, I hope we do get boys that are trafficked too, but.
Yeah. And I think once you start screening, that's one of the things that we often find. And, you know, what's interesting about the district is that they have been pretty progressive in ending the arrests of minors for prostitution offenses, but the fact that there was still deemed a need for the development of the Hope Court, because we're still finding that trafficked children, and predominantly, again, girls, are coming into the system on other offenses that oftentimes are directly related to their exploitation, I think is really telling. And then I also wanted to highlight some of the racial disparities that obviously we found in our report. 97% of girls committed here in the district are Black. We also found that Black girls are arrested at rates 30 times that of white youth, and that's white boys and girls. And so I'm curious, Lashana, if you can talk a little bit about your work around restorative justice, why you think that it's particularly important to serve the needs of our girls specifically, and what we can do to better center the needs of our Black girls here in our community.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Eddie for inviting me, and thank you both for the report. So I've only been working in the field of juvenile justice for a year now, so I was really excited when I saw the report. I started reading it, and I've learned a lot from it just in the first few pages. To speak to how we can center the needs of Black girls who are at risk of incarceration or returning from incarceration, I would suggest that the individuals who are serving these girls share the lived experience of the girls that they're serving, and that they come from the communities of the girls that they're serving. And over the last few months, I've actually met quite a few young women who are doing this work, engaging in peer mentoring and wanting to support girls who are impacted by the criminal justice system or at risk or returning from incarceration. And I think that those approaches that we're using for girls need to be gender responsive and culturally competent. And as I said, the girls who they're working with should look like them and be in their age demographic so that they can connect with them and really benefit and enjoy the programs that they're being offered. And I think we should take do a better job at addressing the whole family and the community, because what I found in my work is that a lot of the girls that I'm working with, their moms have just as much social problems and mental health problems and challenges that they're facing. So it's really difficult to try to work with a youth and steer them down a different path when their parents are sort of influencing them in a different way. And it's all because there's generational trauma, right? There's generational incarceration. And so their moms have often been either victims of mass incarceration or have been suffering from such substance abuse. And so the relationships are damaged. So we have to look at the whole person, which is the youth that we're serving, the girl that's at risk or returning from incarceration, also her parents, her mom, and her community. and see if we can do a better job of getting those entities to work together while we're trying to do the systemic work that you guys have been doing, and that I'm so grateful that you are doing in terms of like reducing the way that we incarcerate girls, and even the way that we're using GPS monitors, and even the way that we're using some of the government programming, for lack of a better term, because we need more community-based programming from their peers, as you spoke about.
Thank you. So the last question that I want to ask before opening it up to our audience is for all of you, and all of you, please feel free to respond. Based on all of your varied and unique experiences and perspectives working with system-involved girls, if there is one thing that you could do, if you had a magic wand and you could fix one thing about the district that would help prevent girls from becoming system-involved in the first place, what is it that you would do? We can start at either end. Sure, yeah, please.
I would create a healthy situation for African-American people to address some of the unhealthy cultural norms that we have been practicing over generations. I would erase sexual abuse from the Black family, and prevent girls from being harmed in their household. And then they would obviously be healthier individuals and not engage in the type of behavior that we've been discussing today. So yeah, I would erase all abuse from the Black family and create a space for us to heal as a community.
I think as we think about young women and we understand their needs, we understand that they experience trauma at a much higher rate than their male counterparts. They struggle with stabilization, mental health, and family challenges. I think knowing that, if I had a magic wand, I would redirect young women to the neglect system, if we could, and wrap them around with services, as many as possible, and/or forge a unit, maybe perhaps between DYRS and CFSA locally, or the child abuse and the neglect system with the juvenile justice system, in order to create a unit that addresses girls' needs. We see the challenges, and I think we need to reinvest funding into community programming.
I would like to agree with Ms. Thompson and Ms. Lane as far as making sure there's more community resources for our families, because a lot of the issues do start at home. And I would actually even like to extend the wand to wishing that they don't even have to be involved in the system to receive those resources, that those resources were just already available in each every ward, every quadrant of Washington, D.C., there will be a safe zone, and they will be known, not hidden, so everyone knew about these resources and that they could take advantage of them.
So I guess if I had a magic wand, I would start with early childhood and a lot of money in the home with parents and children, and then a lot of education between the police department and the school system, so that if there is trauma and the police department has gone into the home for domestic violence, that the teacher is then aware that there's been domestic violence and why a child is acting out. So a lot of resources starting from early on so that we don't end up in the neglect and abuse system. I would say, though, CFSA to put resources into the home as soon as I know the goal is towards reunification and keeping children in the home, but we're allowing things to happen without resources in the home that shouldn't be happening. So not to come into the court system, but many more resources to solve the problems before we get to the sex trafficking and the sex abuse.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you. So I want to invite Eddie back up here, and I want to open it up to our audience to ask any questions related to anything that you've heard up here, anything that Eddie and myself presented around the report. Please feel free to use the mics. If you can just walk to the mics, so that we're videotaping, so if you can walk to one of the mics so your question can be heard. Thank you.
I'm an education attorney, so my view, I guess, comes from the school system, but I'm curious that there's nobody here from DCPS. because as Natalie and Judge Dalton commented, school is a place, all these kids are in school, yet nobody at the school is kind of looking out for this. It is a place where kids could get services when they're not in the system. Early childhood kids, that's where you start. And even the girls, the high school kids, if there was a resource at the schools, maybe they wouldn't get into the juvenile justice system. So I'm curious why, DCPS should perhaps be part of this conversation.
I would like to give you a comment off that. I would agree. However, the population that I come from and the population that I work with today, believe it or not, majority of us aren't making it in DCPS schools. And often it's because we're getting put out because the staff there aren't equipped or trained enough to work with us. So majority of us, myself, I graduated from an alternative school. And even at that, I would say it's definitely a lot of more resources needed in the education department. With me, when I was able to recover my credits at a transitional school, which was used to be placed at DYRS down 458 Street, there was a transitional school immediately for the young people when they came back into their community, they could recover their credits and get into the proper grade that they should be in. That school helped me a lot because it gave me a sense of confidence, and I knew I was very more smart. No one wants to be 17, 18 years old in the ninth grade. That's very discouraging. So that school gave me courage and confidence to take over the world now. But I think the young people need that education support. So that's a very great question, but we need the support from all agencies, DCPS, DYRS, CFSA, DBH, mental health. We need all the agencies to come together.
Yes.
I think I've heard from other school systems, and I don't want to speak for DCPS because I haven't heard that we're doing it fully, but other school systems have a whole cadre of people at the school. So if you remember the young African-American girl who was ripped out of the seat by the police officer when she didn't respond to him appropriately, there's a social worker, there's a police officer, there's a whole panel of people that can deal with the child and the issues in the school and restorative justice with the other victim if it's the teacher or the child. I don't know that we have that yet in DCPS, but that's something that we should have to keep girls out of the system and to understand why they're misbehaving.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, raising the issue of the schools. I mean, we cite data in the report around the fact that Black girls are suspended at much higher rates than their white counterparts, in some cases more than 6 times, and then out-of-school suspensions more than 9 times that of their white counterparts. And again, much of this we know goes back to really subjective views around, girls. And I think, there's been some really powerful research coming out of Georgetown looking at what they brand as the adultification of girls and the sense that girls of color and Black girls in particular are seen and perceived as less innocent, or, them advocating for themselves is perceived as defiant or misbehaving. And so I think that is important. And then to your point, Natalie, I think, the goal is that this is not an issue that any one system can solve on its own. And I think that collaboration and communication among systems is incredibly important if we want to really make a lasting and sustainable change in terms of our response and in terms of better supporting our girls.
Yeah, and I think to maybe try and tie it together from all the comments that are made, in DCPS, we have 1 security guard for every 114 students. We have 1 social worker for every 254. And 1 psychologist for every 570. So when we're talking about where we place our priorities and how we fund our priorities, we're not focused on the investments that we need to make that Judge Dalton talked about, the wraparound supports, right? The individualization that Natalie talked about, and the need to really not push kids out, but meet young people where they are, and particularly meet girls where they are, serve their needs, and connect them to the broader community, right? All of these different agencies are part of one large ecosystem. And because they're so siloed, we often forget that. No agency is going to be able to solve this. No matter how much the front-end agencies want to push kids to the juvenile justice system because as a city, we do better than most at responding to their needs. No kid should have to get involved in the juvenile justice system in order to get the services to make them productive adults to begin with. So I do think I agree very much with the comment that the schools need to be part of this conversation.
I would say there's one program that is beginning at the court, which was started with the suggestion by Mr. Racine. There's a number of parents over at OAG that have not been petitioned or brought into the court for not sending their children to school. And so they approached our mediation group to see if we could only do it with people who are not in the court system, to see if we could get parents to mediate before incarceration to bring their children to school. And so I think it was a great idea of his, and we're working with our team to see, I don't know the success rate, it's just starting, but hopefully that will solve. I mean, I think what you said is important. It really has to start in the home, too. I mean, it has to start with pushing the child to go to school. Which one of us, I don't know about you in first grade, but I went kicking and screaming. And, I went to Catholic school where there were nuns who I was terrified of. So, I mean, we need a program where parents are definitely ensuring that these little people are going to school because they're already starting off with a lot of weights on them. They're poor. They may not have computers. They can't compare to kids who have a lot of money. And then if you miss 20 and 30 days of school, that's it. You end up like in ninth grade where you're at a seventh grade reading level. Nobody wants to go to school at that point and be embarrassed. So hopefully Mr. Racine is going to help us with that problem in the court.
Please feel free to come up and just line up behind the mics for those who have questions.
Lining up is a lot. Okay. Hi. Good morning. I'm Laura Furr. Among other things, I'm also the chair of the DC Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. And this report is super timely. Thank you very much, because we are actually right now in the process of writing our 3-year plan for Title II funding from the federal government. So this is something that's going to definitely inform that. Excited to see part 2. And so wanted to just ask if the data, and I haven't dug totally into the report yet, was showing us where most of the arrests are happening. And I'm tying here off of this conversation that we're having about schools and wondering if a lot of them are schools calling in police for arresting girls on campus or near campus, and whether we know that yet or whether that's just a conjecture that I'm making at this point.
So this particular report does not go into the specific data of either where the arrests are happening or where young people who are arrested reside. I do know from looking at the data, at least a few years ago, the breakdown was about 70% of all kids who are arrested in the district live in wards 5, 7, and 8, and 95% of all arrests are of kids who live east of the park. So the arrests fall very heavily on kids of color. We know that 95+% of kids who are arrested in the district are Black. Another 3 to 4% are Latino. So it's falling on kids of color, primarily poor kids, and it's a pretty high rates. DC has done a much better job over the last 5 years, and I think this is part of the overarching decline that we see, at least in boys, of not arresting in the schools. So when I first started my practice about 10 years ago, every day I went to pick up, which is the initial hearing court, there would inevitably be 1 to 2 cases that I would get just from a school fight or some type of school incident. We see a lot less of that now, in large part, I think, because the Office of the Attorney General is doing a really good job of playing a gatekeeping role and pushing the school systems to say, the juvenile justice system is not your disciplinary system. You cannot outsource this to us. You need to start building the capacity to handle it on your own. So I think we're seeing some very good trends in that respect.
I would say one thing that just entered my mind. I remember sitting at a meeting and Mr. Lacey from DYRS, and I said, well, let's talk to the police about why we aren't arresting white kids and why we're arresting African-American kids, because that's the only place that we can find out. And he said to me, well, we don't want to arrest white kids. We want to arrest less African-American kids. It's not like we're looking to increase the population, which made me think that there are probably wealthy, because a lot of the disproportionality in the district clearly is money. And this is not to say that white girls aren't getting sexually abused, but that definitely can be covered up by families. So we need to deal with those girls too. But I was thinking in terms of, we got to arrest more white kids. He was like, no, we got to arrest less black kids. So, an interesting thought.
Hey, how are you doing? Shakira Washington from National Crittenden and National Girls Initiative. So one of the things that sometimes feels a little, well, I don't want to say discouraged, but oftentimes we talk about how we're going to deal with young folks once they sort of reach 9th grade, 7th grade, you know. From my perspective, this seems like it's almost like a too late approach. And I'm just kind of curious if there are any efforts that are happening in terms of early childhood health care, pediatric care, if there are any efforts in the district that are really looking at sort of like our Department of Health to begin to address these issues around trauma and need of services and programs, even before kids even reach school age. So we're talking from birth to age 5. And I'm just kind of curious if there are any efforts that are going on around that.
I don't know a lot about the initiative, but I do know that it's Dr. Matt Bill. Do you know him? And he's doing a lot around trying to service families in these same communities that we were just speaking of, and reaching families who have infants and toddlers and supporting them with the different social dynamics that they're dealing with. And so you might want to research him, or maybe Eddie could connect you. But I do believe he has a new initiative involving trying to reduce trauma with very young families who have very young children.
And I can talk about from kind of a global and then a macro or a micro level. So globally, I think one of the things that the district is doing well is starting to reframe the discussion into a public health approach, right? So how do we look at prevention, intervention, and reaction, where if you look at our budget as a city, a lot of the money is spent on reaction rather than prevention and intervention. So I'm encouraged by the shift in the discussion to really focusing on a public health approach. I think we're still in the early stages of that, and I still think it tends to lean much more towards the reaction and the intervention rather than the prevention and the real early investments. That said, I think DC is ahead of a lot of other jurisdictions. So we have, you know, quote unquote universal pre-K here, where most families can get a pre-K 3 slot, which is, they're not necessarily all high quality. That needs to be worked on as well, but families have that availability. I think Councilwoman Nadeau introduced a home visiting bill that would expand home visiting programs, which is a fantastic early intervention that really works with families prenatally and then throughout the first few years of life to really provide in-home support to young mothers, to young fathers, to prevent abuse and neglect, to prevent instances of hospitalizations, et cetera. Additionally, there's a bill pending that would create an ACEs commission for the city. So it's a group of folks that would actually get together and study across the District of Columbia what are the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences that exist in the district. One of the things that we do highlight in the report, which we haven't talked about, is some of the data that currently exist on that. So for black girls in the District of Columbia and black women, we know that of any of the demographic groups, they suffer the highest prevalence of trauma and the highest total different types of trauma that they suffer. And in fact, when you look at it by age group, we actually see that 18 to 24-year-olds are reporting among the highest rates of trauma. So, right, these are the kids who are often just coming out of, transitioning out of our juvenile and child welfare systems, and they're the ones who have reported experiencing some of the highest rates of trauma. So hopefully that ACEs commission will really start digging into the trauma that different communities have experienced in the district, and then we'll have some productive solutions that'll help us get ahead of it.
Wow.
Hello, Eddie, and to the panel. I think it's been an extraordinary discussion. I have not had the opportunity to read your report. My name is Tyrone Parker. I'm the executive director of the Alliance of Concerned Men. We've been around for 26 years, really boots on the ground in the community. And I'm speaking from an anecdotal perspective in the contents of the things that I've seen. over the years. As we look at the statement of black and white pertaining to youth coming into our correctional facilities in DYRS, where I recall so clearly when Vincent Cerati stated that he had not seen that one white kid come into the facility, as well as Clint Lacey. So when you begin to look at these type of examples, you begin to wonder, what the hell is going on? I mean, right before our eyes. And then when you look at the actual communities themselves, that basically, I would say, the black communities do not have the safety net to be able to absorb the kids as they get into the challenges that they're confronted with. And consequently, by not having the safety nets, and we all want public safety, we've got to look at ways as to how do we build these particular components within our communities. I come back to my last statement to ask that as we begin to examine the causes, we could say gentrification, and there's a number of moving parts, but one of the most instrumental parts that I'm seeing is the arrest by the police. When they arrest kids and they go to channel them into the different directions, what is occurring there that allow for so many to go into the correctional facilities and others not to go? Thank you.
MPD? Oh,
I think about the adult calendar when kids were getting arrested for marijuana, and mostly African-American kids were getting arrested for carrying a joint of marijuana. And I will not mention the name of the judge because we're not supposed to give our opinions, but there were security guards bringing kids in from Howard for marijuana. And she said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to tell all my friends not to send their kids to Howard because I haven't seen any kids coming in from Georgetown and GW for marijuana. So you keep bringing them into my courtroom from Howard, and there's no kids that I know going in. So it is an interesting issue because everybody knows that white kids smoke marijuana like black kids do. So anybody has people in their family. So we have to ask ourselves, I mean, now we don't have kids arrested for that, but I think the police commander and the commissioner for children that we meet on a regular basis with Commander Dickerson is looking at how to solve this problem of why we're bringing in kids. We're bringing in less kids now with the Juvenile Justice Act, but it's a very good point. I think the judge I kind of liked what she said, even if we're not supposed to give our philosophy. It kind of stopped the kids coming in from Howard at least.
I would like to say, I think from the family perspective, the parents don't feel that supported. A child's number one advocate, protector, sense of security is our parent. And when the parent doesn't have the knowledge or the support about how to advocate for their child in the school system, oftentimes I've been a victim of, I don't want to deal with them folks. You got yourself involved in jail, you better get yourself out. The parents aren't included. So what happens is that's why the system takes over. So I think it's very important to, just like we stated earlier, to have resources available to support the parents through that process so they can make sure that their child is not being taken advantage of by the system.
No, I was just going to say, I think income inequality as well, the resources, point blank and period, resources. I have the resources in order to prevent you from furthering my child into the juvenile justice system because I'm able to pay for a lawyer, send them to a better school. Our families don't have the capacity to do that. And even in terms of, I think as a city, how do we have interagency collaborations, right? We have a lot of resources in this city. How do we work together as a community in order to funnel our resources into the places that is needed to deter our young women and our young men from entering to the juvenile justice system is the question. And I think we have different initiatives that are awesome, like the system of care that brings together community resources with government agencies agencies to talk about and formulate committees to talk about challenges and how we could address that. But I think also now, as we think about young women, we know that they're different from males. So it requires a different reaction, a different solution. And I think it's important that we get together and we talk about that. One of the things that we're attempting to do at DYS is offer co-locating space to different agencies that we see that are essential, like mental health services, substance abuse services, and counseling. And we're offering preventative services. We don't want intergenerational families coming to us. We want to extend services to young people so that they're able to receive preventative services and their younger siblings do not come into our systems and come to us. And then also, just the healing. There's a lot of violence going on in our communities, and we have to talk about that. We offer restorative justice circles. We offer a safe space for young people to come in, and our programs are engaging. That's the other thing as well. We talked about having engaging resources for young people. They don't want to go into environments where it's a bunch of adults and they feel as though they don't have the same challenges as them. I think it's important that we reinvest our resources into communities in the right way.
Thank you. So you want to say something?
Yeah. Oftentimes so we used to hear from parents all the time, I really tried. I tried to get my young person connected to a mentoring group. I tried to get them connected to mental health services. And all I kept hearing was, you can't do that until they get involved in a system. Abuse and neglect, juvenile, whatever it is, right? And so it comes back to this notion of resources being directly invested in community members. Our black youth in this city, and particularly our black girls, walk a tightrope, right? When I was a kid growing up, it was more like bowling in a bowling alley with the bumper lanes. You made a mistake and you just kept bouncing back and forth from one to another until you finally got to your goal. Black kids in this city walk a tightrope where if they make one mistake one way or the other, they're falling off, right? And so it comes back to this notion of investing directly into the families and the communities without the systems needing to get involved, providing them with the supports that they need. Trauma, and particularly grief, is a huge one that all of our families face, from the violence they see in their communities to loss that they have in their own lives. And it's difficult to get high-quality grief counseling, for instance, for a family who lives in wards 7 and 8. It's incredibly difficult. I'll share, after many years of trying to unsuccessfully connect my clients to a grief counselor in DC, tried to go to one myself for something that was going on personally. And with personal health insurance, it took 4 months to get connected to someone. For a young person who's in crisis, right? I had the resources to withstand, not a big deal for me, but a young person who's in crisis and a family that doesn't have those supports and that buffer, it makes it much tougher for them to withstand that. I think that's one of the huge reasons we're seeing the white person who suffers trauma, the family can often provide that buffer, that wrap around those supports. They can pay for them, they can find them, they can access them. In wards 5 and 7 and 8, our young black kids are unfortunately, no matter how hard their parents try, often unable to access those same resources. And so the only thing left at that point are the juvenile justice system or the child welfare systems, who then try and step up and fill that gap. But our kids shouldn't have to go through that in order to get those services.
I would say that I represented a couple of wealthy African-American kids and one white kid that came into the system. And I remember one of the families kept saying, why you keep telling the judge I'm working at the White House? And I was like, you'll see. And a motion to dismiss for social reasons were granted in all 3 cases. And that was in the days when you could do it before adjudication because the family could provide services. They were wealthy. And that's why I kept saying, he's working in the White House, she's doing this. And it's kind of sad, but I'm with Eduardo as far as trying to get services. I've called from the bench sometimes to call mobile crisis, to call the hotline at CFSA, and I got to move on with my calendar. I've been on the phone for 40 minutes. So if I'm not sophisticated, and I've been in the system, working with the system for years, if I'm not sophisticated, I'm going to give up. I've got too many other things in my life to do.
Yeah, so this can be, we have time for one more question, unfortunately.
We need to end on
So-
a high note. Positive.
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone. This has just been wonderful. My name's Joy Cass. I'm a psychologist, and a clinical consultant at St. Anne's Center for Children, Youth, and Family, which is a teen mother residential program. And of course, pregnancy adds another whole layer of complication to a lot of the girls that come to us in the juvenile justice system. So I just wanted to ask you, in the report, did you look at teen pregnancy? Did you look at the stats there? And just if there was anything that would be helpful. And I also left some brochures for St. Anne's too, if anybody wants to take one. So thank you.
So we did look at that, and you know, one of the things that we have found throughout the course of our advocacy at the national level, and of course, you know, trying to get some of that data has been very difficult. That's just one of the things that is not tracked for, particularly among juveniles in the justice system. We were part of a federal task force that the Department of Justice put together looking at issues of pregnancy and predominantly the use of restraints on pregnant women and girls. And one of the findings was that although we have that data for adult women in the criminal justice system, we really don't have any idea of that data for young people at the juvenile justice level. And so that's something that we have advocated for in the Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act reauthorization that's pending, and fingers crossed is close to happening. It's closer than it's ever been. And so that is something we will begin tracking for. So it is discussed as part of the national overview and trends as something that we need to look at more carefully, because of course we know that a lot of, you know, marginalized girls are at higher risk for teen pregnancy. Many of them are pregnant and parenting, and those are needs that need to be addressed if they are justice involved. So it is mentioned. Unfortunately, we don't have the specific data. And so I think we can do one more question if.
Good morning, Penelope Spain from Open City Advocates. And I was just wondering if there are any lessons learned or lines of inquiry that have shown different ways of doing things for all youth. You know, is there a look, are we learning things about victimization, traumatization, that makes us look at how we treat all youth in the system in a new way that might be more effective?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways for us is that although, again, looking at the macro level and looking at all of the reforms and research and great work that's been put into place over the last decade or so that has reduced overall youth contact with the justice system, dramatically reduced rates of youth incarceration, I think it's really important to disaggregate that, right, between gender. And so for us, we found that girls haven't really benefited from that. So I think the response has to be nuanced. And you know, we advocate for there to be a gender and a racial justice lens applied to these types of issues, because I think what's been really clear is this gender neutral approach to reforms don't really benefit all of our youth, and particularly as we're seeing these rates rise for girls. So I think, you know, the lessons learned for us is that there's a lot of different factors at play. I mean, one of the things that we hope to drill down into in our second report is to look at the reasons why girls are coming into increased contact with the system. I mean, clearly we have our own hypotheses, and speaking on behalf of Rights for Girls as advocates, we know that there's a lot of paternalism at play, a lot of increases in policies and procedures that start to really look at and label girls' behavior as delinquent, when in fact it doesn't really pose any serious threats. A lot of issues of paternalism in terms of when we look at how simple assaults are the huge proportion of the arrests, you know, hearing from systems professionals from times saying things like, well, you know, that's not expected behavior for good girls, right? But if young boys are perhaps involved in that type of behavior, it's more understood as, you know, boys will be boys behavior. So I think it's really important to disaggregate. And I think one of the things that we're continuing to push for, both nationally and locally, is not only the disaggregation by gender, but also by race, and to cross-tabulate that so we can actually not just see what the total number of racial disparities are and the total number of gender numbers are, but to actually see like how many Black girls we're looking at, how many Latina girls are we looking at, and to ideally be able to even break that down further in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think we really do have to take an intersectional approach and a lens to this issue in order to meet the needs of some of our most vulnerable kids, because the drivers are unique and distinct, and I think our responses have to be distinct as well in many cases.
So to end on maybe, as Ms. Thompson-L says, a high note, at least in the court system, there are still federal grants, and we did get some grants for juvenile behavioral diversion court and Hope Court to train us for the girls that come into the system how to handle it differently. So hopefully judges will be better at not detaining children for violating conditions of release when it's definitely related to issues like that. But hopefully this paper, we will be able to come back and look at, have we improved, have we made any changes?
And I think to end on another high note, at DWARS, we've been able to be very creative with our funding and how we address girls' needs. And now we know that with advancing youth development, things have gone really well with our youth engagement specialists and just identifying creative programming for our young women. However, we're now at the juncture where we are going to have all staff trained in trauma-informed care and bringing a trauma approach. So even with art, so for example, we've offered an art class, but we were able to offer art therapy. And it was through, it's interestingly enough, we utilized trap music to do it, the vendor that we identified. But the girls were able to talk about what love looks like to them and, some of the trauma that they experience. So we are becoming more creative in the ways in which we address the trauma that our young people face, and we're taking a more systematic approach as it relates to how we address that.
Can I just say one thing that always amazes me, and I hope it amazes you, and you start to think in terms of like being a woman, whether a woman of color or a gay or a white woman. Are you still amazed that you read the paper that we're #1 killer is heart attacks, and they're still studying how to identify it in women? It's 2018. So I think we have to think really strongly every day about how, as women, we're going to move forward. And I think there's a lot of men that are willing to help us do that. I think we've learned that in Me Too, to give a shout out to the positive men like Eduardo here. I mean, but really, doesn't that bother you?
Yes.
Natalie, do you want to add in Lashanya, and then I'll wrap up?
I don't really have any additional thoughts to leave with. Just that I'm really excited about the work that we're doing at the Attorney General's office with the restorative justice program and giving youth who cause harm in the community an opportunity to sit down with the person that they harm in the community and work it out without getting the court system actually involved in whatever agreement that they come to. So they come to an agreement as a community as to what the young person should do to repair the harm and make things right. And even though, like you were saying earlier about the numbers, even though the numbers are what they are, I was noticing that, like, out of the 3 guys that started with me, I seem to be the person with the most amount of cases involving the most amount of youth. And it's a lot of times, even though you were speaking about whether or not it's happening at schools, a lot of times from what I see, it's either happening at schools or near schools. And so that just speaks to our need to work together more as a community to try to address these situations, because it's usually just girl fights.
Yes. Natalie, do you want to?
I would just like to say thank you to everyone for addressing girls' needs in the system, because they definitely need it. The DYRS has come a long way since I was a young person in their system, and now today working with them. So that brings hope to me. And I also would like to just say, to provide the opportunity. When an opportunity is presented, you'll be amazed at what our young ladies can do.
And I'd like to answer the question from the perspective of myself, which is, while I got that wonderful shout out from Judge Dalton, which I appreciate greatly, I'll be frank that I'm very embarrassed that it took us this long as an organization to realize the unique needs of girls being different. And when we were doing some training earlier this year, when we train defense attorneys, we have a lot of different lenses that we try and get them to apply to their work. Adolescent development, race, trauma. And it wasn't until this year that we really asked the question about, how do we become a gender responsive defense attorney doing this type of work? And it shouldn't have taken us until 2018 to do that as a community. And so I'm hoping that this report, I mean, it's been a great learning experience for me personally, but I'm hoping we'll start getting people to ask those types of questions. Because at the end of the day, what I learned big picture is it comes back to the notion of individualization. So we have to meet young people where they are. And girls have unique needs that for a long time have been ignored, in the shadows, not paid attention to. So we need to start elevating those needs. And I think coming back to Ms. Del Valle's point, they're the best ones to do so. And so a lot of what we need to be doing is listening as we're moving forward and really engaging them in the work.
Can I suggest that, I gave a speech a couple of weeks ago on women, and one thing that I think many of us have in common is, as attorneys, whatever profession you're in, as judges, a lot of us lack self-confidence. You hear sports guys or men in power say, I deserve this, whereas I might say to my husband, wow, every day I'm lucky. I got this job as a judge. I can't believe I got this job as a judge. So I think we have to give the girls that come into the system, despite who the judge is, a voice to speak out, to speak with confidence, don't stand with your head down in the courtroom, but I try to say to them, tell me what you want. If you don't want to speak, fine, but we have to give them a voice, and we have to give ourselves the voice of confidence to give them the voice of confidence. But I think we have to realize as women, many of us lack confidence that we should have.
So, thank you guys so much for coming out. I just want to close by highlighting, I think, some of the most glaring statistics that we highlighted in the report, and all of these are there pretty much in the front. But I think, what's critical to realize when we looked at what's happening to our girls here in our community in DC, over the last 10 years, arrests of girls have gone up 87%, while they've fallen for boys 22%. 97% of girls committed are Black girls. Black girls are arrested at rates 30 times that of white and girls and boys, and 60% of girls who are arrested are 15 or younger. And I think these are just some of the glaring findings that the report uncovers. And I think, for all of us, what we hope to come out of this report is just a sense of urgency that, our girls and what they're facing can no longer be invisible, can no longer be ignored, and that, as we can see, they are their own powerful advocates, and it's on all of us to really empower them, to put them front and center, and to be able to, fully advocate for a better response, because what we're currently doing is just insufficient. And so thank you all for being here on this very snowy day. We will be sure to share copies of the report digitally, as well as the video of this event, as well as some digital graphics that we're hoping you will all share to really help illuminate the findings from the report and help urge action. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And please, let's give another round of applause to our panelists as well.